what I wanted to speak to everyone about is the need to reach beyond those who are already looking at systems and complexity. There's a lot of different terms we can use. I won't even be consistent myself. I apologize, but I think the best term to be looking at is systems and complexity literacy, and the ability, even if one isn't an expert in the area, to at least have an appreciative understanding of that. And I think that's what we really need, and we have some really severe obstacles that we need to overcome if this is going to be something other than a bunch of us just speaking to one another on an ongoing basis. So, oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. So, disclaimers. The first thing is that this is not something that I claim I've got all the answers. I would argue I don't even know all the questions. But the bottom line is that I've been around the block a few times, and I've seen a lot of successes, a lot of failures, both as someone trying to do the persuading and as someone who's trying to be persuaded. And even specifically in the area of systems and complexity, for the last many, many years, I've been on both sides of a lot of arguments, and I'm inviting you to add my experiences to your own as we consider how we can do a better job of reaching the rest of the people who don't yet understand that to be the case. So as Joachim keyed us off today, we have a terse little motto of connect, collaborate, and consult for our little society, the International Society for Systems and Complexity Science for Health. The problem is that that first step is absolutely essential for outreach. If we can't connect, then it's almost impossible for us to go on to collaborate and to consult. And the problem is that that first point of connection is the all too often point of failure. And so the first part of what I want to talk about briefly is that we need to connect more and to conflict yet less. Now, what do I mean by that? I am partial to the term the next normal rather than new normal. I think we are seeing a series of transitions, and we will see incremental disruption and then a period of relative homeostasis perhaps, and then another disruption, another period of homeostasis. And so I like the word or the term the next normal. And the next normal, many people characterize by the term VUCA. If you're not familiar with VUCA, it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And what it means is that at any moment, circumstances could change drastically into something that we really can't predict, that we can't manage through traditional methods, and we're not even able to fully understand it or exactly understand it. We saw, as a prime example, COVID, where in relatively short time, many of our systems were turned on their ear. So when we have an environment of VUCA, of things of this unsettled nature, the biggest thing that we've learned, even the ones who don't understand and don't profess systems and complexity yet, they're realizing the previous mindsets and methodologies are insufficient. Clearly, there were multiple places where things didn't work out the way we wanted. In some cases, they failed drastically. And so those of us who understand systems and complexity know that we have to cultivate systems and complexity literacy among the greater populace, among the decision makers and among the world population in general. I use that term literacy because I'm borrowing it from Peter Tuddenham, who was one of the people in the worldwide effort to get people even in landlocked areas to realize their dependence on oceans. And after he was involved with that, did an excellent job with that, he's now an advocate for systems literacy. And I think we need to do the same thing, that every single person, at very least, every educated individual, every public servant, every policymaker, anyone who's going to be in an active role in their world has to have a basic functioning literacy of systems and complexity. A tall ask, but I think it's an absolute necessary step to go forward in a world of VUCA. Now, that kind of transformational thinking requires change. Spoiler alert, right? We're not used to thinking that way. We have to transform the way we and everyone think. That's a change. Change generates conflict. There's no way around that. If you want to go back to mathematics and physics, change in momentum, dp/dt, we change the momentum over the course of time. We need to change what we're doing, but that generates a conflict. It's a break from status quo. It's a break from the habits, the behaviors, the assumptions, the methodologies, the mindsets. All those things have to be reviewed, and that's going to raise conflict. The problem is that conflict often ends up distracting from, even upstaging, the objective that we're pursuing, which in this case is a transformational thinking, the cultivation of that systems and complexity literacy. So what do we do about that? Well, we have to understand that conflict is itself part of a larger system. And the way human beings seem to be hardwired to do this thing is a we versus they, and us versus them. And one would hope that someday we'll get beyond that. But even in the systems and complexity community, we fall into this trap of othering. We fall into this trap of those of us who know what we're doing versus those of us who really need to learn a thing or two. And the problem with that, if we think back to Peter Senge's 11 Laws of the Fifth Discipline, there's a lot of those that are applicable, including number one, today's problems often come from yesterday's solutions. That's a big one. But the even bigger one I want to talk about today is the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. And far too often, especially when we're talking about public policy, we push the system as if it's ours to bulldoze. And we are indignant, we're flummoxed, we don't have a clue about why all of a sudden the system is pushed back. And so I think if we're gonna fly the systems and complexity banner, we better understand ourselves and this complexity and systems literacy effort as part of this larger system. And we are working to do change in a system. One of the things that I think is helpful to frame this is Aristotle's pillars of persuasion. It goes back a couple millennia, but it's still a very important perspective, and I'm going to use this to frame some of the other points I'm going to be making. And realizing that we don't have an appellate authority to do this. We can't go before a judge or a magistrate or a king or an emperor of the universe and say, hey, we're right, they're wrong, make them come along alongside us. We have to persuade. We have to bring them from where they are to closer, at least, where we would have them to be through persuasion, rather than force, rather than obliteration, rather than the tyranny of the majority, if it gets to that point. The three pillars of persuasion, starting with ethos. This is, in shorthand, this is credibility, character, trust. We have to establish why the people who aren't already in bed with systems and complexity, why they should believe us, why they believe that they should listen to us, why they should trust us, that we're not just going to lead them down into a worse situation for our own benefit. This is the ethos pillar of persuasion. We'll talk about each of these in a little bit. The next pillar of persuasion is the logos pillar. And the logos is the reason, it's what we would call the rational argument. And this is, the components of this are the facts, the logic, the reason. This is where we think we put our most of our effort. We even have some problems here. And the last pillar of persuasion is the pathos. These are the emotions that are involved in the audience and the people whom we wish to persuade. What is their past experience? What do they envision their first experience to be? Can they identify with this as something that they want to buy into, or is it all just gobbledygook and irrelevant to them? So ethos, logos, and pathos are the pillars of persuasion that I think are far too overlooked in our outreach to people who don't yet understand and have this degree of systems and complexity literacy. So some of the foundations for ethos. Number one has to be respect. And this is hugely lacking in all of our public forums. I mean, we all can't help but see the divided partisanship between the we's and they's. And respect starts with this cautious openness to the possibility that they might disagree with us, they might have come to a different conclusion, and that doesn't mean that they're ignorant, unsophisticated, or evil. And that they, moreover, might have essential knowledge, skill, insight, or wisdom that we have overlooked. That's respect. And it's closely tied with humility, which is the cautious openness to the possibility that we don't know or understand everything, and that they might have something to teach us. Without these two portions of laying the foundation for ethos, it's very, very difficult to get someone to trust that we've got anything useful to tell them. A couple other foundations for ethos: appreciative competence in what we're trying to persuade them past. And in this case, it's the linear, it's the analytical, it's the reductionist. We're going to talk more about that in greater detail towards the end here. But having an appreciative competence in these things, we've talked about the lessons from improvisational theater. Yes, and is the byword that we have to use here. Too many times, the systems and complexity argument is positioned as the new thing that's going to sweep away all the crap from the reductionism and all the evil, stupid people that were good at that. The holistic approach, systems and complexity approach, is a yes and complement. And we're going to go into details why the linear, the analytical, the reductionist is still critical. It's still absolutely critical. It's not being sidestepped. It just needs to be supplemented. And then as part of that, we need to lead by example. If we're asking a bunch of other people to learn a whole new way of thinking, a whole new sets of methodologies, we jolly well can learn what their world is a little better. And we can understand that, yeah, there's times when that really is important, and we can become more informed as we do the yes and. If we don't do this, we risk the appearance of being ivory tower academics. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been in a conference, or I've listened to a presentation, or I've just listened to a one-on-one debate where someone basically comes off as, I don't know nothing about linear and analytic and reductionist. I don't know anything about it, but I can tell you you're wrong, and I can tell you I'm right, and I can tell you the world's future is complexity, which puts me on top and you on the bottom. Now, I don't think that's really the message we want to give, but a lot of times that's where it comes out. And that's why we have so many difficulties in bridging what we're trying to say to people who aren't there yet. And that ties into the last foundation for ethos, which is ideological neutrality. Now, when we are focusing on a systems and complexity outreach, we need to be ideologically neutral. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to forget that we are human beings with our own belief system, our own priorities, our own ideologies. But when we are being apologists for systems and complexity literacy, we have to emphasize the methods, the methodologies, the tools. We have to downplay the specific outreaches, the specific conclusions, perhaps that we have come to using systems and complexity that may not be where someone else goes. And we need to be using systems and complexity literacy to build bridges, not to burn bridges between ideologies. So respect, humility, appreciative competence, and ideologic neutrality are what I would observe are the foundations for ethos, which is that first pillar of why would someone even care to give us the time of day and listen to us. So from ethos, we move to logos, the reasoned approach. I think most of us would agree that facts are objective, empirically reproducible, and empirically verifiable observations of interactions in the real world. We often sort of gloss over the fact, no pun intended, that facts are themselves subject to bias, to assumptions, to new, updated, corrected information. And we saw that with COVID-19. Yeah, you needed to use a whiteboard to keep track of what we knew to be true about COVID-19. And that doesn't mean anything other than what we say are facts are the results, first and foremost, of empirical information and processing. All too often, these things are conflated with what are beliefs and values and objectives and priorities, which are driven by the beliefs and values. Realizing that an individual's subjective, personal belief system, value system drives what their objectives are, drives what their priorities are. This forms a decision-making rubric that assigns relative weights to relative facts. This is where systems and complexity really shot itself in the foot with COVID-19, because we assume that everyone has the same objectives. We assume everyone has the same priorities. We assume everyone has similar beliefs and values. And why can't we just do what the science tells us to do? Well, the truth is, science can't tell us what to do. On a good day, when it's time tested and completely shaken out, science can give us probability distribution functions of effects due to certain causes. But what we should do is driven by those beliefs, those values, objectives, and priorities. And that has been largely missing as we vilify people on both sides of the mask debate and the immunization debate and all these other things that are related with health. The last foundation for logos is that when we're talking about reason, historically, what we were talking about was mathematically sound inferences based on logic, based on set theory, based on if this is true, then we can know by definition that this is then true also. Now, this has gotten a lot of shade recently for various reasons, but when we start backing away from mathematically sound reason chains, then we are opening it to the Wild West of anyone can declare anything they want, and it's all on equal footing. And we've seen that on both sides of COVID-19, and we see it in this whole systems and complexity debate as well. And so in order to have a good foundation, even for the rational portion of our argument, we have to remember that beliefs, values, objectives, priorities are subjective, personal, and not given in any situation. And if you're wondering, well, someone else may have biases, but I certainly don't, I would like to point you to this one website of many, that this slide, this is just for shock and awe value. These are 60 cognitive biases, fallacies, and other ways we trip on ourselves when we're trying to observe the world and draw conclusions from what we observe. This is just a sampling of all the different ways that we can fall short. But if we're saying that we're infallible and they're wrong, and they say, well, you're not infallible, we torpedo our ability to make and to hold a compelling, rational argument. Foundations for pathos. The first foundation is relevance, where we have to illustrate the application, the applicability with case studies that are concise, that demonstrate in fairly short order where systems and complexity thinking can provide clear incremental benefits and solutions to something that was intractable under the old mindsets and methodologies. Too many times, again, I hear presentations and conferences where someone says, well, systems and complexity, that's the way to go. And it's really cool. And you can't ever understand it. And the best you can do is hire someone like me as your high priest to interpret the entrails of the sacrificial animal. That gets on to accessibility. This is not just something that experts do and the mere mortals have to suck up. Accessibility is us instilling confidence in our audience that they too can do this. Not only is it effective at making things solvable, or at least closer to solvable than the previous impossibilities, but it's something that they themselves can do. And again, too many times in these circles, there's a snobbishness, there's an aura of mystery, there's an elitism that is off-putting. And the emotional response that comes from the audience is, to hell with you. If that's the way you're going to be, I'm going to stick with what I'm doing. And the final foundation for pathos, I would point out, is hope. We have to cultivate an optimism that things can get better. that this is not just fairy tales, that this is actually what we're talking about is a pathway to things getting better, perhaps even by their definition, not necessarily by ours. There's a greater likelihood of better outcomes by their own objectives and metrics. That's hope. And by these three things, the ethos, logos, and pathos, we've laid a better foundation for persuading someone who doesn't already drink the Kool-Aid, who isn't already steeped in some systems and complexity. And so how do we take that to the next step? How do we build bridges instead of burning them? Because otherwise, we'll never connect, we'll never collaborate, we'll never consult. I believe the most effective tool, guess what, comes from the systems thinking community. Polarity thinking, a term coined by Barry Johnson, is an excellent tool that doesn't get used nearly enough when we're talking about polarities, when we're talking about huge discrepancies between ways of thinking. And the foundational truths of polarity thinking include there is truth and wisdom on more than one side of the issue. Arguably, there's truth and wisdom on every side of every issue. Just think how much of a difference that alone would make in all the debates about COVID and masks and immunizations and lockdowns and travel restrictions and all these things. If we just said, wait a minute, I don't agree with their conclusion, but they got a lot of stuff that's worth thinking about. What a difference that would make for us to converge on actionable public policy, even if we don't agree on every jot and tittle. Truth and wisdom on every side of every issue. That every side, each side is incomplete without that truth and wisdom that the other can bring. This is we go to the both and, or the yes and, not the either or, where we look at things as complementary, not as competitive. And this polarity thinking is absolutely essential at all sorts of levels of the dialogue. One of the important levels is at the ideological level. Most ideology families come down to this individualism versus collectivism. How much emphasis do we put on the rights and obligations of the individual versus the rights and importance of the collective? Now, very few people are purely one way or the other. I don't know a single individualist who believes that we shouldn't have cooperation with one another, and I don't know a single collectivist who believes that individuals are just cannon fodder to be chewed up for the greater collective. So somewhere in there, we need a synthesis, and we need that polarity thinking, that yes and, that both and, that individuals are important and collectives, the groups, the societal structures are important as well. But it's not just the ideologies, it's also the methodologies. And this is when we're getting to reductionism versus holism. Again, to hear some proponents talk, we're going to get rid of all the bad reductionist people and thinkers, and we're going to replace it with holism, and we have nothing but sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. That's not what we're looking at. That reductionism and holism are important polarities that need to be synthesized together. One of the graphical means that polarity thinking, polarity management uses is a polarity map. Now, we're not going to run through this a lot. This is taken from the Polarity Partners website, so check it out. But the idea is that we look to see what happens when we go too far in one direction or the other. What happens if we go too far individualist? What happens if we go too far collectivist? What are the early warnings? What are the action steps to do the correction? Same thing. What happens if we go too reductionist? What are some of the problems that we face? What are the problems when we throw all the reductionist baby out with the bathwater and we focus solely on the holistic perspectives? So the polarity map is a graphical means of documenting how, at least point by point, we can examine what does it mean to find the truth and wisdom on both sides of ideological and or methodological debate. Because without that, we can't have collaboration. Collaboration doesn't mean we agree on everything. Collaboration can exist in the presence of hugely divergent ideologies, objectives. It can exist with hugely different people in on different journeys, But here and now, on this particular point, they say we have shared objectives, we have shared threats, we have shared opportunities, and we can find some basis, even amidst all the divergence, even amidst all the things where we might not agree, where we may strongly disagree with each other. We can find those areas of shared values, shared beliefs, shared wants, shared needs, which provide the safe area for a collaborative environment where we wrap something around the we and the they, and it becomes us. So with that, I want to introduce a whole bunch of reductionist versus holistic polarities, if you will, and I'll outline them on one slide, and then take it from the crowdsourcing here. If someone wants to pick one of them, and we can walk through what I have on the slide as a starter for conversation, and then we can do further discussion on it. At least for this, I'm sure there's dozens of these, but for this presentation, I identified 11 talking points, polarities, if you will, of reductionism versus holism. And this is framed from the reductionist standpoint. This is the way, this is the status quo. These are the way things are done right now in our social, political, economic, in our healthcare. These are ways that are, in most cases, proven to work, and we wouldn't be where we are good if we hadn't done these. But there's a yes and that, and so those the things that have served us well in the past, but we need to look at supplementing, include standardized processes, prescriptive answers, linear thinking, reductive analysis, intentional design, scope and partitioning, hierarchy, top-down design structure and constraints, command and control, specialization and focus, and concern with efficiency and cost effectiveness. Now, probably should have said at the beginning, I come from both worlds here. I come from a strongly reductionist, plus I'm very strongly holistic as well. And so I've seen these arguments go back and forth, and I just wish people would see that they're complements rather than competitors to one another. But let's open it up to the floor here. What would somebody like to start with as we examine how we can frame our holistic toe in the water against reductionism in a way that says, look, what you did before wasn't bad, but we can do it better with these added tools. So pause for breath here. This thing on?
Thank you, Kevin. I give you my two Bob's worth.
Okay.
Reductionism is a special case of holism.
Oh, so you're going to go all to Einstein and special and general relativity?
No, I think from a conceptual point of view, that a systemic approach can easily integrate linearity, or in the sense of reductionism, where there are limited connections. Whereas I, from experience and also from theory, can't see that it is possible for linear thinkers to use that as a starting point to end up in interconnectedness. There is a leap to be made in the way of thinking.
And I'm going to say yes and to that.
And while saying that, I'm embracing the notion of yes and.
My formal training and my industrial experience for years was in reductionism, and we would not be having this conversation right now over the internet, on computers that have chips that have millions and millions of transistors in them, without the analytical skills of engineers. So that's where the yes and comes in. But even in the reductionist, hierarchical, linear, all the things that complexity and science people tend to gloss over or love to hate, there's always this idea that that it's a bit artificial, and it's even borrowing systemic concepts before we knew there were systemic concepts. When we talk about something, there's the boundary, what we would in system world would call the scope, and there's inside the system, and everything else we say is outside the system. And so reductionism is really, it's a subjective view of, are you making your scope too small where you ought to make it big? Because we as human beings, as finite human beings, once upon a time, the number was 7 plus or minus 2, that we can only keep 7 or 5 to 9 things in our mind at one time. And when you think of the untold trillions of atoms in the, or go subatomic particles in the entire universe, I'm not sure, but I think that's bigger than 7 plus or minus 2. So in order to solve any problems whatsoever, at some point, we have to do what you were talking about. We have to say, I know there are interconnections here, but I'm going to try to choose my scope boundary in such a way that the interdependencies beyond my scope of interest are less important than the interdependencies within my scope of interest. And reductionism is arguably, depending on who you talk to, it's either the confession that there are things that we're ignoring, we're being purposely ignorant of interdependencies, or it's choosing those that where we do it unwisely. But that would be my response to how you put reductionism in a systemic context.
Okay, are there any philosophers in the audience? I know that Francesco has thought about these kind of things. Maybe I can call on you again, Francesco.
Well, I'm not a philosopher at all. I'm a psychologist, and so it's quite difficult to say something useful in this interesting debate. I used to work in a field where the benefits of systems thinking and the complexity are so evident, because when you work with individuals and their families, it is so evident. But also, having said this, I have to confess that in the field of psychotherapy, for example, this issue is quite often underestimated. And so, what to say? I think the latest presentation is very important, because we have to try to convey the idea that what we think that it is obvious for us, it's not obvious for many of the opinion leaders in the healthcare systems at all. Even the biopsychosocial model is criticized in mental health. So I think we should consider systems thinking and biopsychosocial model as not granted, and we have to, as Nortrup said, produce evidence of what is useful in this way of thinking, step by step, with methods, and not talking about ideologies. And so I think this is the main objective, I think.
Well, maybe it would help for me to go to one of these slides. So I'll go to the first one I have here, standardized processes. And so the line of thinking that I used in preparing this, hoping to spur some discussion, is standardized processes have been incredibly important, especially in the industrial age, because the rules, the best or standard processes bind continuously, and they can be applied generally and routinely. And again, this has served us incredibly well in the past. And to say that this is something that we need to throw out because it's seen its day is missing the point. However, what we say as we come alongside this is that we're now seeing more and more cases where we have unknown unknowns, where we see significant emergence of the interaction of these elements, where the cause effect is unpredictable, where we've got confusion, or we've got to do something before we really know what we're doing. And so this is where what served us well in the past, no shade on it whatsoever, needs an adjunct, which is where the systems and complexity literacy comes in. And so the holistic complement to this, many people will tout the Cynefin framework. Now, I think Cynefin is oversold a lot of times. That's a separate debate. You want to rile my feathers offline, we can go toe to toe on this one. But there's a lot of really good things in the fundamental concept that, depending on the situation, now whether it's 4, 6, 8, or 2 doesn't matter, but on a situation specific basis, different approaches. I mean, I think that's what Michelle was talking about before. On a situation specific basis, we would want to look at different approaches, because sometimes formulaic is effective, sometimes adaptive, sometimes investigative, sometimes exploratory are things that we need to do because of the situation itself. One size does not fit all in these cases. And that's where systems complexity literacy comes in, alongside the very well-established lean industrialization standardized processes. And yet, even that systems and complexity literacy can paint us into the opposite corner, because we may be premature in our assessment of a situation as purely chaotic. There may be patterns that are discernible, and we're just not seeing them in time, and we're missing an opportunity to be more deterministic, more intentional. Because let's face it, with COVID, time was lives. And so the sooner we can get a grasp on something, the more we can save lives. So the drawback to what sometimes happens in these systemic complexity invocations is we're premature to declare it chaotic. All bets are off, all rules are out the window. When we emphasize act, sense, and respond, which is the prescription in the chaotic quadrant of Cynefin, to people who spent their lives keeping things buttoned down for very good reasons, it's hard to tell that from fake it till you make it, or from throw it against the wall to see if it sticks. It's really hard for someone to say that there's a difference between those two. And even when it's the only option, we have to remember that there's substantial potential risks of time, energy, resources, opportunities, and collateral damage while we're trying to act, sense, and respond. And if there was a better way, if we were in a different Cynefin quadrant, we would have saved some of that. So this is an example of those 11 areas. Does this help to get some discussion going of how we can be respectful, come alongside the reductionist standpoint, and say, here's where you can take it even further in a broader array of situations?
Well, since I asked about philosophy and no one else put their hands up, I think to understand it in a slightly different context, how those are relevant is by looking at George Ellis's exploration of top-down causation in complex adaptive system. What he means by that is that you have a hierarchy from the top to the bottom, where higher levels pass on information that constrain what lower levels can do. So in the end, an atom doesn't care with whom it mates to form a molecule, as long as there is some instruction there that says do it for a purpose. And it comes back to Michelle's point early on. We need to think about what is the right scale to look at, but never forget that it always occurs in a context. And to me, that's really what Humboldt has brought to the forefront, and pragmatically has largely been ignored. He was so meticulous about taking recording every measurement he made in its entire context. And it's so accurate that the climate scientists now have shown that the tree lines have risen by 500 meters since the early 1800s. So we really need to, I think, have this back and forth and say, for small problems, if the scale is small enough, reductionist thinking is absolutely crucial to make progress. We wouldn't have the internet without people thinking about physics and how to use some of the properties of physics to get us to the meeting today. But in the end, having that understanding without putting it into a context to implement it, we wouldn't be here either. Again, that's the top-down, bottom-up relationship.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I agree. I think that I agree with Arkham's original point about the having a very broad systems framework actually. And although you don't like Cynefin framework, I think it actually, if interpreted appropriately, actually, in a sense, accepts that you have very, very small, non-context influenced linear processes that can be reproduced and, you know, and controlled. Then you have more complicated, complex. So I think it's a good descriptor. It doesn't give you a direction. It doesn't tell you what to do, because the problem about complexity as opposed to linearity or the dominant model is the linear model has a lot of steps. I can work out if I'm doing some analysis what steps I should take. I can work out if I'm doing a randomized controlled trial, how I can meet the criteria. But if I'm really to analyze what's going on in, for example, superutilizers, the randomized controlled trial actually really breaks down because it's a non-linear process. And yet their proponents are saying what you need is better controlled trials, more detail, so that you've got absolutely, you decontextualize it and it becomes in a way meaningless. So I think that I think that it might be in the past that people, in the golden days of complexity thinking, people might have been critical of linearity. I think the modern view is that we're critical of linearity that does not take into account complexity and non-linearity and dynamics. But I think I mean, in my work, I have to work in all those areas. I think in terms of the superutilizer framework, what was so exciting to me is to find that one person in the whole world that I could find was doing modeling and looking at superutilizing as a nonlinear process or multiple mixed processes. And if you look at the main literature, it's all about descriptive and it's all descriptive statistics and trials, assuming linearity. So I think that's very problematic. So yes, we accept linearity. Linearity is great, and it's easier. It's easier to deal with. Anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing here about the complementarity. I think one of the benefits to me of the Cynefin framework, and even using with it my students, is it offers a way forward. Any situation can have aspects that are in all domains, depending on the context. And if we're in one domain and we want to move knowledge or move the situation and understanding to the next domain, we have a path forward. And I just happen to have a really concrete example from a research presentation I heard from a colleague today about looking in how patient rooms are cleaned in a hospital. And they used a complexity lens to do modeling of how each environmental cleaner went in and cleaned the rooms to map how many divergent and different ways they approached cleaning, and to come up with the model so that they could then map and understand and see patterns, so they could move to the more simplistic and say, if we give training and do things in a more linear fashion, the room becomes more clean. And everyone follows the same path, because the dirtiest place in the patient's room was the rails on the bedside. So by using the complexity lens, and in that somewhat complex where we observe and we map and we try to discern patterns in hindsight, they could move to a more complicated and then more simplistic. And I think that's the both and thinking we're talking about, because that definitely would influence patient care and the quality of patient care. So hopefully that's a good example, timely that I saw that presentation today.
Yeah, it's a very good example how to get from one to the other and turn back. Kevin, thanks a lot. It's thought-provoking like always. Hopefully we can take this as a starting point for this final session of brainstorming how to move forward.